everybody, and welcome. Thank you all for joining us today. My name is Dr. Kira O'Neill, and I am a volunteer with the Canadian Science Policy Centre, or CSPC. I'm delighted to welcome you to this panel organized in partnership with Brain Canada on screen time and the developing brain. I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Mi'kmaq people. I recognize the peace and friendship treaties that govern this land and honor the Mi'kmaq as the past, present, and future caretakers of these lands and waters. I also want to acknowledge the histories, contributions, and ongoing presence of the African Nova Scotian communities who have shaped this region for over 400 years. I invite you to take a moment to reflect on the traditional lands that you are joining us from today. And with that, I will turn it over to Alison Palmer from Brain Canada, who will continue with the introduction. Hi, Alison.
Thanks, Kira. Welcome to this important discussion on screen time and the developing brain, taking place during this Mental Health Week 2025. As Kira mentioned, I'm Alison Palmer, so here on behalf of Brain Canada, it's been my pleasure to convene this group of bright and thoughtful panelists and moderator for you today on behalf of Brain Canada. As a parent of two small children, this topic resonates for me both professionally and personally, so it's been a real pleasure to help to organize it. Brain Canada, for those who aren't aware, is a registered charity and national convener of the Canadian brain research community, funding high-risk, high-reward brain research programs across the country. As a national organization, we acknowledge that Brain Canada offices and funded research sites are located on the traditional ancestral territories of many Indigenous peoples. We honor and pay respect to Indigenous elders, past, present, and emerging, and are dedicated to moving forward in the spirit of partnership, collaboration, and reconciliation. On behalf of Brain Canada, I want to thank our partner and host for this webinar, the Canadian Science Policy Centre. The CSPC is a nonprofit, nonpartisan, and non-advocate organization that serves as a hub for science and innovation policy in Canada. A few more points of introduction before launching into our content, which I know you're all keen to hear. Brain Canada is dedicated to providing a safe space for everyone. So we have a zero tolerance policy for discrimination, harassment, and hate speech. Thank you for contributing to a safe space today where everyone can connect, learn, and grow together. In that spirit, please feel free to introduce yourself in the chat. Tell us who you are, where you're joining from. CSPC will also launch a poll shortly where we encourage you to share some of that information about yourself in a poll format. A reminder, please use the chat for that. Use the Q&A for any questions. We welcome questions throughout as opposed to in the chat. Also note that you're not visible today. We are in a webinar format. The event is being recorded, so it will be available as a recorded video on YouTube shortly. And now I am pleased to introduce your moderator for today, Dr. Franco Vaccarino, Professor Emeritus and former President and Vice Chancellor of the University of Guelph. Dr. Vaccarino also spent 30 years at the University of Toronto as a professor of psychiatry, psychology, and neuroscience. He's held senior leadership roles at U of T and at the Centre for Addiction and Mental Health. He's also a Brain Canada board director. I'm fortunate to have the opportunity to work alongside him, in that role on important events like this. So thank you, Franco. Handing it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Alison, for that kind introduction and for all your hard work in putting today's event together with the CSPC team as well. And welcome everyone. We have a coast-to-coast audience today, and it's wonderful to have you join us. Let me begin with a few words about why we're here, why this topic matters, and the format for today's panel session. The focus of today's panel discussion is on the impact of screen time and the use of digital technology on brain and behavior development. And here we're talking about from infancy to childhood to adolescence, looking broadly at the effects of screen time and content, not just at social media. And by the way, also I should mention, including the indirect effects of parent and caregiver screen time effects during infant development, for example. So today we've brought together an absolutely terrific panel of experts and thought leaders who I'm going to introduce in a moment. And they will be sharing their perspectives and thoughts on the impact of screen time, but more generally on the impact of interaction with what I would call socially geared digital technologies on youth and the developing brain. Now, an interesting observation leading up to this, underscoring the importance and the urgency being given to this topic, to this issue, it's worth highlighting a few recent policy and regulatory decisions that have been taken by communities and countries. And these include, for example, and I'm sure that some of you or many of you have heard or read about these, bans on cell phones in schools in certain Canadian jurisdictions, Ontario school boards who have filed lawsuits against social media giants, and in Australia, the banning of social media use for children under 16. And I mention these because they highlight how top of mind the effects of screen time and digital media use are for so many communities, including parents, educators, youth policymakers, health professionals, and I would say also the technology sector. The two key questions that today's panel will address are, as we try to better understand the benefits and the risks for young people, what does the research tell us about the effects of screen time and digital technology content on the developing brain during youth? A second question is, really, have we reached a threshold of understanding from the research perspective on this topic to actually fully inform policy, including how to preserve the benefits while minimizing the risks? So that's a bit of the context. In terms of the format of today's panel, we're going to spend the first 20 minutes of the discussion hearing from the panelists as they share their views and perspectives. And then we'll take audience questions and have a general discussion for about 30 minutes, and then return to the panelists for final thoughts coming out of the discussion, which will take us to the end of the session. So we're going to begin with some comments. Without any further ado from the panelists, let me now introduce to you today's panelists. So I'll go through the full set of panelists, and then we'll hear individually from them. Welcome to Dr. Patricia Conrad, who is a professor at l'Université de Montréal at Centre Hospital Universitaire de Saint-Justine in Montreal, specializing in preventative mental health and addiction. She co-leads a key Brain Canada funded research program, and she is the incoming scientific director of the CIHR Institute of Neuroscience, Mental Health and Addiction, which, for those of you who don't know, is the key federal funding agency for mental health research in Canada. We also have with us, and welcome, Dr. Emma Durden, who is an associate professor at Western University, who also leads a key brain-funded research program and studies the effects of screen use on brain function in children. Welcome, Emma. We also have Dr. Michelle Ponti with us, a pediatrician and chair of the Canadian Pediatric Society's Digital Health Task Force, which focuses on the health effects of digital and social media use in children and youth. Welcome again. I'm also delighted to have with us Vidhi Desai, a student and mental health advocate and a recent graduate of the University of Calgary, as well as a future master's student at McGill University with experience as a behavioral aid for children with autism. Welcome, Vidhi. Also with us is Dr. Munmun Dechoudry, an associate professor at the Georgia Institute of Technology and expert in computational social science. She has advised prominent organizations, including the U.S. Surgeon General's Office, the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, and the World Health Organization on digital mental health. And finally, let me introduce also Dr. Sarah Grimes, who is a professor at McGill University studying children's digital media cultures and rights in the digital environment with a focus on games. So that's our panel, and it's a real point of pride for me to be moderating this session. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for taking the time to share your expert advice and reflections today. Let me again reiterate to the audience before we begin that you'll have the opportunity to submit questions through the session using the Q&A function rather than the chat function. There's a Q&A function, and Alison Palmer from Brain Canada will identify questions, and in the event of multiple questions that are related, we will group the questions accordingly. As well, just a quick mention that we'll be sharing the resources referenced by our panelists throughout the chat. And now over to the panelists to share their opening thoughts and perspectives on today's topic. And we'll begin with Dr. Patricia Conrad. Patricia, over to you.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Brain Canada and CSPC for organizing this really important session. So I am a clinical psychologist and a scientist who studies risk factors for mental health and substance use disorders. I focus on factors that disrupt brain development and how that disruption then leads or translates to risk for mental health and substance misuse. So I don't declare myself to be an expert on digital media by any means, but I stumbled into this area, and I'll give you a really quick historical perspective. So in 2012, I launched a longitudinal study on child brain health or adolescent brain health. And it's a very large population-based study of about 4,000 seventh graders who were recruited to a study and followed every year for 5 years. And if everyone recalls, in 2012, nobody believed that young people would engage with social media. At the time, I think there were concerns about young people's use of video games, but it was only after the release of the next generation smartphones that young people were exposed to new digital media platforms and social media platforms, and their use of those platforms really took off. And we were very fortunate back in 2012 to just add a couple of questions about young people's social media use, their video gaming use, as well as other digital media use into this longitudinal survey. And what came of this was our ability to do some very unique longitudinal modeling of the effect of social media use and other forms of digital media use on youth mental health, as well as on their cognitive development. At the time, there were no studies that had included such measures using a longitudinal design. So most of the evidence was cross-sectional and is beginning to reveal a potential relationship between social media use and mental health. And so our first study on social media and depression, it was actually digital media and depression, where we reported a very specific effect of social media on teen depression, received an enormous amount of attention, and really it shocked me at how much attention this study generated in 2019, to the extent that my student and I essentially responded to media requests from 5 in the morning until 10 o'clock at night for 2 weeks straight, and the attention continued. And we ended up on CNN International and various other media outlets because there was just such a dearth of evidence on the topic, but enormous interest. To the extent that this study was even discussed in the US Congress when the CEOs of Facebook and Instagram were invited and asked to discuss the potential impact of their products on teen mental health. This is before the Facebook files were released by the Wall Street Journal and subsequent investigations. So I'm very proud to say that Canadian data and studies have contributed to the dialogue on the role of digital media in youth mental health. and have been at the forefront of putting pressure on industry to revise their products and the product designs in order to make them safer for young people. In a nutshell, what do my studies show? I'll wrap it up in 1 second. What do the studies show? What we showed repeatedly is that the more a young person uses social media relative to other forms of digital media, the worse off they are in terms of mental health. We demonstrated relationships between social media and depression, social media and risk for eating disorder symptoms. We showed that social media also impacted on young people's executive functions, ADHD symptoms, and aggressive behaviors. And finally, we were also able, using this unique data set, we were also able to comment on some of the mediators of these effects. And what we showed was that you were not able to explain these effects by a displacement mechanism. So you could not explain this by how much social media was causing sedentary behavior. It wasn't a sedentary behavior effect. What it was social media appears to be changing how young people think, what they think, and how they think. It makes them more impulsive, disinhibited thinkers, and it also appears to slant their attitudes towards substance use, towards themselves. They engage in upward social comparisons, and they're more susceptible to hostile attributions. And all of those effects on their thinking styles appear to explain their risk for increasing mental health symptoms. The last thing I'll say is that our studies didn't demonstrate any benefits at a population level of social media on youth mental health.
Great. Well, thank you very much for those context setting remarks, Patricia. Very very interesting, and I'm sure we'll have an opportunity to navigate through some of these points through the discussion. Let me now pass it over to Dr. Emma Duerden for her thoughts on the topic. Emma.
Great. Thanks so much, Franco, and thanks as well to the CSPC and Brain Canada for organizing this panel discussion today. So I'm a Canada Research Chair in Neuroscience and Learning Disorders, and I'm also a professor in Applied Psychology in the Faculty of Education at Western University. And I study children's brain development, things in the environment like screen time, in terms of how it can impact brain function, structure, as well as the associations with children's learning memory abilities and their mental health. And over the last several years, we've been conducting studies tracking children's screen time over 2-3 year periods in relation to their mental health. We've also conducted in-person brain imaging studies with toddlers, children, teens, and young adults, online studies. And this has culminated into data for well over 1,000 children, teens, as well as their families. And we study everything about screen time, from passive TV watching to playing video games and scrolling. So I come to this work from multiple lenses. So I'm a neuroscientist, I'm a clinical researcher, and my students train to become school psychologists and counseling psychologists, and they are working in mental health services for children and youth across the province of Ontario. And my students often report what we see in the data, that screen time is increasingly becoming part of children's everyday lives. And we have children and teens coming to the lab reporting that they're spending 13, 15 hours a day on screens. And I've been really fortunate to share this research, to be invited to schools and community centers, and I've spoken directly with children, teens, parents, grandparents, teachers, retired teachers, social workers, school psychologists, as well as at events with bank executives and corporate leaders. And really across all of these diverse groups really is the concern about screen time on children and youth. And this is just a really striking and consistent finding. So what does the science say about screen time and children's health and well-being? Well, we know that for very young children, toddlers, that excessive exposure to screen time can place them at risk for developmental delays. So things like language delays, and this has been supported by brain imaging studies. We also know that for older children and teens, that the 2-hour guideline, so limiting screen use to less than 2 hours a day, which has been put forth by Canadian and other international bodies, that this is supported by research. And children and teens who are exceeding that guideline, particularly on social media platforms, it can place them at risk for things like anxiety and depression. And these types of findings have been supported by the internal studies conducted by the social media platforms themselves, showing associations with eating disorders and poor mental health. So in turn, where does this leave us? So despite all of this information, screen time isn't currently being tracked like other health metrics, things like sleep or blood pressure. And in turn, this is really why we need informed science-based policies, not to eliminate screens, but in order to guide their use responsibly. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for those comments. Again, important points that we'll be able to drill down as the panel session unfolds. I'd like to now pass it over to Dr. Michelle Ponti for some of her comments and perspectives. Dr. Ponti.
Thank you, Franco and Allison, Brain Canada, and CSPC. It really is my pleasure as well to join this conversation today. So as described earlier, my primary role is clinical. So I practice pediatric medicine at CPRI, which is a children's developmental and mental health facility. And I also teach and supervise pediatric trainees and residents at Western University here in London. And as well, I have served as chair of the Canadian Pediatric Society Digital Health Task Force since its inception in 2016. And so through all of these roles, I have seen the impacts of technology change over the past few decades, from primarily TV viewing to now mobile tech and AI and internet safety. And so through all of this clinical work, I kind of assimilate this research that we've just touched on. And, along with the rest of the world, I'm experiencing the profound impacts, both good and bad, of technology on child development and parenting practices and family life in general. People tend to go to their doctor when they're unwell or if they have a problem. So I tend to only see the problems with screens. And in fact, screen time use is one of the most commonly cited problems in clinical practice today. And there are key developmental differences across the lifespan. So when we consider screen impacts, it really makes a difference if I'm seeing a toddler or a preteen or a teen on what those impacts may be, and then the guidance that I may provide. For example, I recommend no screen time at all for the under twos. There is no evidence to suggest a developmental benefit, with the exception of video chatting and possibly those high quality apps that can support early literacy. The caveat here in either of those scenarios is that a parent must be present to transfer what that toddler is seeing on the screen to real life experiences. And then on the other end of pediatrics is counseling for adolescent health, whose offline and online lives are so intertwined. There's evidence that a little bit moderate use of screens can be beneficial than no use at all. And we can get into that a little bit more in the panel discussion. And full disclosure here, by trying to balance and not always succeeding these professional roles with being a mom to 3 kids, I really am a strong advocate for healthy screen use in family life. And in order to maximize these potential benefits of screen media and reduce the risk, I use the guidance we developed by the Canadian Digital Health Task Force and the 4M principles, which includes minimize, manage, model, and monitor. And these principles provide age-specific recommendations on screen time and usage. And we're also now examining the impacts of screens on children with neurodevelopmental disorders, and specifically social media effects and problematic screen media use in older kids. And I have come to realize that this is not a parent or kid issue. This is a societal issue that needs a societal solution. So I'm glad to bring the voice of children and pediatric developmental health to the discussion today.
Great, thank you very much, Michelle, for those comments, and thank you also we present ourselves in a professional context, but I appreciate the bridging of your personal, life as a mom, together with your professional side. So thanks for that, Michelle. And now I'm happy to invite Vidhi Desai to say a few words. And as I mentioned, Vidhi is a student doing some very interesting things and soon to begin a master's program at McGill. But Vidhi, over to you.
Thank you. So good morning or afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're located. I'd like to first thank Brain Canada and the CSPC for including youth voices while discussing this topic. And my perspective will be informed through my lived experience. So through roles on national youth advisory councils, my work with the UN, research labs, and public health panels, I've had the opportunity to explore how screens impact young people, not just as a researcher, but as a peer and advocate. And with this panel, I hope to leave you with the impression of how vital youth involvement is in the discussion we're having. So my stance on this entire topic is that for youth and children, digital health is mental health, and yet we still see them being treated as separate conversations. We know from research, including Canadian studies, that excessive or unregulated screen time in children and teens is associated with things like cognitive delays, poor sleep, and emotional dysregulation. And this isn't just an abstract concept. So as a behavioral aid, I work with children who struggle with social emotional development that's been shaped by digital overexposure. I've seen parents and caregivers being concerned with how much screen time their children are receiving. And this is not to say that screen time is inherently negative. We also see productive use of screen time through learning apps and digital connectivity. But it's important to recognize that while screen time is a necessity today, the formal consensus on it still remains very vague. And touching on some of the positives, as a children's book illustrator and author for national mental health campaigns, I've seen how art and education can transform the narrative, but only when they reach young people where they are, which is on screens. Through my work, we've been able to reach thousands of people across the world to reconcile our efforts and work towards global change. And this is possible through social media and digital use. And even now, we are all able to meet and listen to each other through Zoom. And through this discussion, we will be able to help inform the narrative on this topic. So with that being said, I do believe that some of the actions that schools take, such as banning cell phone and device use, spread a narrative that is not well informed, but rather transforms devices and screen time to be a negative tool that needs to be guarded, rather than seeing it for what it is, just another tool that can enhance learning. I do believe that part of the discourse exists because we still don't have a formal digital health and wellness strategy in this country. We have guidelines, we have passionate youth, but we don't have the infrastructure, funding, or accountability mechanisms to ensure that digital environments are safe, balanced, and empowering. A youth-informed digital health strategy would mean things like national media literacy education, co-design with students, regulations on persuasive tech features that target developing brains, and public funding for school and community-based programs that promote screen-life balance. And most importantly, it would recognize youth not as passive users, but as collaborators in crafting healthier digital ecosystems. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Vidhi. Super important points, and particularly emphasizing the digital health the need for a national strategy or broad-based strategy, and to have youth as active participants rather than just passive, being seen as just passive users. So thank you for those introductory comments. And now over to Dr. Munmun Dechoudry to say a few words as well.
Thank you so much, Franco, and thank you, Allison. Thank you, Brain Canada and CSPC for this wonderful opportunity on a very timely topic. So Franco already kindly introduced me very quickly. I'm a computer scientist by training, and I came to working in the digital mental health space about 14 or 15 years ago. Currently, I'm at Georgia Tech. I'm a professor at the School of Interactive Computing. I direct the Social Dynamics and Wellbeing Lab over here, where we study social media and mental health. And then I also co-direct a center, which is a partnership between Georgia Tech and the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where we are looking at how technology and digital solutions can be brought to the fore in order to move the needle on pediatric mental health. So as I mentioned, I'm a computer scientist, and my work kind of broadly focuses on what we can learn by harnessing the large-scale data that people leave behind on digital platforms, and how do we bring AI and machine learning so that we can understand our behaviors and our mental health dynamics in these evolving and deeply, increasingly more intertwined digital environments. In particular, relevant to this panel, what I do is I study the role that social media in particular plays, so it can help us understand how it impacts our mental health in positive as well as in negative ways. So just a little bit of tidbit about social media. I have been studying social media from 2006, so before the term social media existed. And some of you might recall one of the big social media platforms at that point in time was MySpace. So we have come a long way from the times of MySpace. Digital platforms, especially for young people, are very much a part of their identities today. It's not a thing that you do on the side. It is very much a part of who they are, how to think about life, and how to think about their social interactions. So how do we better understand how these new technologies and emerging technologies are constantly shaping our mental health? That has been the goal of my research over the last decade and a half. So what have we learned? We have learned that social media plays clearly a very prominent role, but that role is not predominantly only negative. In fact, the role that these technologies play in mental health is very complex. And sometimes the negatives and positives of these platforms can be contextualized in the lives and situations of a particular young person. So let me unpack that a little bit. Let me give you a little bit of teasers from my own research that highlights this complexity of social media and the way it is in some ways a double-edged sword, right? So what have we seen? We have seen that oftentimes these social media platforms provide a place for connection for people, especially young people. It provides a place for peer support at a critical moment of identity development, identity exploration. And then it also especially is helpful to youth who are navigating challenges in life, whether it's life transitions, their experiences, different events, and so on. But we have to notice all of these benefits in the context of also the harms and potential challenges that these platforms are bringing to the fore. And that means these platforms, for some people, can amplify feelings of isolation. It can expose individuals to harmful content. We have seen that these platforms can promote or reinforce dangerous health behaviors, and the list goes on. But what is really the verdict at the moment based on what we have seen in the research that we do? The verdict says that the patterns of how young people engage in these platforms, and that's not just what they're saying about their screen time use, but what they're posting, how they're responding to others, even the timing of their activity, all of these together are very important, and that they can signal underlying mental health challenges, whether it's depression, anxiety, or psychosis, or positive journeys in terms of recovery, in terms of social connectedness, and so on. So the influence that these platforms bring to the fore, it often depends upon context, it depends upon the content of their interactions, and that the individuals, who these individuals are. It matters what their existing vulnerabilities are, what support and protective factors are present, both online and in their offline lives. So let me tell you a little bit about how we arrive at these conclusions, right? So a little bit from the measurement side, one of the things that my research does is I consider not just self-reports of people about their screen time use, which we have seen in ongoing work that people can significantly over or underestimate how much time they're spending in front of screens. When we go beyond those notions of screen time use and try to unpack what happens during that time when the screen is in front of the young person, we begin to see a lot of these complexities. So what my research does is that we rely on what people are doing, what their activities are on these platforms. And that includes not just what they're observing, but what they're sharing, how they're interacting, but importantly, how the algorithms on these platforms are shaping our experiences. There is no standard Facebook or Instagram anymore. Our experiences on these platforms are increasingly curated by algorithms, and that impacts whether we are positively or negatively impacted by them. So my research takes all of these into account, and it quantifies essentially these naturalistic uses of these platforms in situ, where, why, when people are using these platforms. And we focus on longitudinal study designs and bring in a lot of methods from the causal inference world in order to really establish what is the causal relationship between social media and these mental health outcomes. I'm also very passionate about policy, and Franco touched on that earlier on in my introduction. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a glimpse of how we take this research outside of the proverbial ivory tower and try to make a difference in people's lives. One of the policy-related aspects that my research shows is that it's so important to think about literacy among young people. Self-awareness is key for any kind of mental health concern, right? And if we encourage young people so that they can reflect on how they are feeling before and after being on social media, that can go a long way. Because if they notice a pattern of anxiety or low mood, this type of awareness can be a cue to reassess their use. Importantly, it is also very important to cultivate essentially offline sources of connection, and we should encourage young people to pursue those. We should consider young people and their experiences in a collaborative relationship with the adults in their lives, with their teachers, with their parents and guardians, instead of an adversarial one where the adults make decisions about what a young people and when a young people should or shouldn't use social media. These partnerships between young people and adults can go a long way in building trust among different stakeholders, all of who are committed to keeping our kids safe going forward. But it can also lead to a future world in which we are not coming up with unrealistic policies where we ban social media, because let's be honest, the cat is out of the bag. The question for us going forward is, how do we make progress towards a safe and healthy world where we all are working towards a common goal with trust, respect, and mutual partnership? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Moon. And now I'm going to pass on to Dr. Sarah Grimes for some her comments, and then we are going to open it up. And I already have received some questions in the Q&A that I will feed back to the panel that are related to some of the comments. So thank you again. And Sarah, over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Franco. Thank you to Brain Canada and to the CSPC for inviting me. It's already an interesting conversation, so looking forward to the Q&A next. My own research on children's digital play and creative practices also lets me see many of the benefits and positives that digital technologies can bring to children's lives, for their well-being, for their social relationships, for their learning, and notably for their rights. When you look at the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, it's clear that multiple children's rights are directly implicated in today's conversation. Not only the rights to be protected from various harms, but also the right to information, the right to education, the right to play and take part in cultural and creative activities, as well as the right to have their voices heard and to be involved in decisions that impact them. The 54 articles outlined in the UNCRC provide an established framework for improving children's lives around the world. And in 2021, the committee released a clarification of how these rights apply in the digital environment, General Comment 25. I was Canada's co-lead to the Global Children's Consultation for the General Comment 25, and most of the children we talked to across age groups cared deeply about their rights and how digital technologies sometimes advance and sometimes infringe on the different rights that they have, depending on the application, the context, or even the company involved. They also describe digital technologies as presenting both benefits and risks. Benefits such as providing entertainment and leisure, tools for self-expression and identity formation and experimentation for participating in the creation of a shared culture. Some kids code digital games and animations. Others write stories and fan fiction, or record and edit videos, and participate in creative communities of fellow artists and media makers. Many use their screens for educational purposes, as mentioned already by some of my fellow panelists, researching topics for homework assignments, watching how to do a variety of things, watching how-to videos, or seeking advice from others. Most describe social benefits to using different devices and apps or platforms to stay in touch with friends and family, to make new friends, or to collaborate on projects with others from around the world. Examples include regular Zoom calls with Nana, playing online games with classmates during summer vacation, creating a space for yourself and for others. However, most of the kids that I've talked to over the years also see a range of risks, negatives, and potential harms for themselves and for others. Many feel that they don't know enough about what's going on behind the screens, what happens to their data, how is it being used, by who, by which algorithm, and why. And many want the government to do more to regulate the tech companies. But a key concern among so many of them, and I would say that this wasn't just true in Canada, but of the global study in general, was this worry that efforts to minimize the risk carried out by, well-intending, well-meaning grown-ups will result in them losing access to the many benefits. So this question that was asked at the beginning of the panel about how to minimize the risks while preserving the benefits is really crucial, and it's crucial to young people as well. I think that this can only be accomplished through government regulation, requiring tech industries to respect and advance children's rights, adopting a holistic approach that balances protection from harms with children's various other rights, including access and cultural rights, including the right to access information, to education, to participate in culture. Research on technology designs and on tech companies shows that several dominant business practices are clearly, and in some cases knowingly, as Emma mentioned, infringing on children's rights. For example, their right to privacy through invasive data collection, harvesting, and manipulation. The evidence here provides a very strong case for new policy that advances children's rights by design across the digital environment. And I have more, but I'll leave it at that because I know we're a bit over time, and hopefully this will come up again either at the end or during the Q&A.
Great, Sarah, thank you very much. Again, an important reminder from the the perspective of our, not just young people, our super young people, at the youngest of ages in terms of rights and looking at it through that lens. So thank you for that. As the panelists have been speaking, there have been a number of questions that have already emerged, and I'll start right from some of these questions that are coming from the audience, and maybe I'll divide them into two categories. One, I would say, is from a developmental lens, and Dr. Ponte mentioned about much of this depends on stages, and we in this discussion we're talking about youth in the broadest sense, from 0 to the ages of early infancy right through to adolescence, and of course within that we of course understand that there are multiple stages of development that are actually quite different. And Dr. Ponte talked about the 4 M's and age-specific recommendations. One of the questions that's come up, and I think it's a very practical and important questions for parents and caregivers, and it's about toddlers and perhaps even infants, and the use of media or digital media to keep toddlers and sometimes infants busy and engaged. And the question is, is this a problem, and or conversely, what can we do to increase the positive effects for toddlers and even infants to give parents and caregivers some guidance on this. And I would say that when it comes to infants, the other thing, and I know, Michelle, you've talked about this, is also the indirect effects of screen time, from the point of view of the parental screen time or caregiver screen time, indirect effects on modeling and displacement behavior, that kind of thing, and how that might relate to attachment and those kinds of things. So I'll hand it over to the panel, but I'm particularly looking at Michelle as a pediatrician who works with the youngest of the young. Maybe some comments to start.
Well, you packed a lot in there, Franco. So I'll do my best to try and summarize some of these real life concerns and questions from parents, especially with the youngest of our patients. And so, through the amazing research of many of the panelists and others across Canada, I mean, we know that there's no developmental benefit. The question is there harm to, the under twos? And, and the other piece of this, of course, is parental guilt. I am always aware when I'm doing counseling with the youngest of my patients and parents is we need to lose the guilt. Parents have a tough job as it is. So we get it. You're busy trying to prepare meal, do a chore, and you want to keep your child occupied. So, that 18-month-old, you want to put in pop on a little sort of educational app that you think might hold their attention for a few minutes, that is not going to harm that child. The problem becomes when that becomes all they get and all they do. So it comes around to planning, limit setting, and helping parents decide how am I going to use technology as a tool, as Vidi had mentioned, how are we going to use this as a tool to enhance our lives rather than it just kind of becoming the default all the time. The key in all of this with the youngest of age is they really need a parent present. Co-viewing is so important to help, again, understand what the content is, transferring to real life experiences, again, avoiding any problematic content that might come up. So co-viewing with a parent in the youngest population is vital. And again, I think we shift gears from talking about screen time in the youngest ages to more screen use and how we're using, what's the content, what's the context. We've thrown around concepts of educational materials, recreational materials, social connection. So it really does depend on how we're using it to how much we're using it. So I hope I touched on some of that, but I'll just stop there and open it up to the rest of the panel to add their opinions.
Great. Yeah, thank you, Michelle. Yeah, I did definitely pack a lot in there. And I will say that your comments, just to frame it a little bit, is, reactive versus proactive approach and putting some structure around it would be helpful. So rather than just reacting to the situation and using it as a quick fix, to thinking about it as a deeper, tool that if it can be structured and have a plan for it through the day. But let me stop there and ask for any other comments on this particular piece, and then I want to move to the mental health and mental health related questions. Other comments? Pick up on some of Michelle's points. Michelle, do you want to talk about the indirect, or someone maybe talk about displacement behaviors, in terms of attachment? And I've heard discussions and some are lead up to this on the effects on attachment and development, including screen use, screen time on the parental side in terms of the youngest, the youngest infants and toddlers.
I was just going to, but before you move on to that topic, just reinforce Michelle's point about co-viewing. I think it's an extremely important point. And the earlier you do it, the earlier the family sets a norm for this concept of co-viewing, because it becomes very important during the adolescent years as well. So if there's a social norm in the family, it's something that's going to be easier to do during adolescence. And that said, it's not an easy thing to do with adolescence. And the nature of adolescence is that they, you begin to establish autonomy, and they seek out, environments and situations in which they can be autonomous, they can interact without intervention of their parents. And so, I think this is why, yes, parents need to be able to discuss what young people are viewing and being exposed to in digital media, particularly in social media, as the content becomes shared by peers. It's not edited, it's not curated, it's much, much more complex. And I think this is why many people on the panel are suggesting that certain digital products, particularly social media, at least this is what I believe, need to be revised and need to have a different form of regulation if they're going to be used by young people. They are being used by young people, and therefore by default should be expected to have certain kind of safety mechanisms to them so that they are by default safe for young people. So there's the co-viewing that's important, but at certain points during stages of development, parents do have to allow young people to interact autonomously with their peers. And so that is where regulation of these digital products has to come in. And that's a really important distinction.
Great point. Thank you for that. Emma, do you have
so just wanted to follow up on some of those great points by Michelle and Patricia. Just about for the co-viewing, it helps with those 4 M's in terms of just the monitoring and the awareness. And then also a meta-analysis that came out a couple of years ago, which noted that very few toddlers are meeting screen time guidelines these days. And that one of a risk factor for increased toddler viewing of screens was actually related to parental screen use. So they're kind of on their phone while their toddler is also in front of a screen. So and it was just noted by the panelists today just about how time can just really fly when you're on a screen. So just to the person's question about if is it really harmful, it's to Michelle's point, it's about the time, so about being mindful and monitoring time. And then the other point I just wanted to touch on just for the second question about attachment. So these types of factors, they can impact attachment and things like joint attention. So where children are often learning early language skills. So, pointing at something, naming it, and having that, those very simple interactions, but are so really essential for early language learning.
Great, thank you for that. Let me switch a little bit to mental health and mental health challenges. I've received a number of questions ranging from the effects on neurodivergent children and effects of screen time, but also from parents and caregivers, how to minimize the risk of developing symptoms that we've heard about that Patricia mentioned and others have as well, relating to depression. And Moon, I think, stressed the importance of, it's not just time, but what exactly is going on. We've heard, the importance of structuring and being very deliberate about how screen time is used and what's in it. But maybe we could hear some questions about that. And by the way, the flip side of that coin, so not just the effects on mental health and mental health challenges, but the flip side is, what about the mental health challenges associated with resistance to restriction? So as parents try to restrict, that also causes angst. It causes anxiety, and this is true not just for adolescents. It's true for adults that are frequent users to restrict time, and the mental health challenges associated with trying to restrict. There's a lot there as well, but see if we can at least touch the peaks of those kinds of issues. I'll just open it up. Yes, Michelle, please.
Just jump right in. I think, one of the 4 M's of the principles is make it meaningful. So, thinking about how and, why we're using it, what's the purpose of this? Why am I picking up my phone right now at this moment? Right now, that applies to all of us. So I think that's another M to just sort of be aware of. And the other thing is that anytime we use the word ban or restriction and so on, our adolescents are gonna want it even more, right? So it's about teaching them, and Vidi had mentioned this as well, those digital literacy skills, so that as we're going through childhood and these developmental stages, and we're going through other curriculum, literacy curriculum, math curriculum, digital literacy is being, sort of intertwined with all of the other learning and educational modules, which is so vital for their success, in and teaching them the tools that they need in this digital world, in the digital landscape that they're growing up with.
Great points. Thank you. Sarah, I see your hand up.
Yeah, thank you. I want to link this a little bit to design decisions and business practices, because I was reading the questions as well and thinking about your comment, Franco, about the stress and anxiety of turning off the device or trying to leave the game or having to end screen time before you finish the level of the game or you finish the show. And it's true that there's a lot in terms of digital literacy and resilience and developing healthy media and technology habits, as Vidi pointed out. But we also have to start questioning the prevalence of design mechanics, design mechanisms, business strategies that are intended absolutely to exploit all of our ability to regulate ourselves, our ability to turn these things off. It exploits our emotions. And, increasingly, and in many, it's not across the board, of course, there's good examples, but in many of these applications targeted to children, including young children, to exploit their developing minds and emotions, actually to create unpleasant, deeply unsettling, anxious feelings if you do turn it off before the next level, before the next reward is given. This is a whole industry sector that's emerged based on child development expertise used for the sole purpose of prolonging screen time and engagement. Doesn't matter what the feelings are, there can be fun and pleasure or anxiety and feeling worthless. The important thing for these companies is the engagement. They don't care what the consequences are. And I think that they need to be part of this conversation, because parents alone aren't going to be able to manage this. It's becoming increasingly sophisticated, customized to the individual child using AI, algorithmic feeds and recommender systems, just tailored just for me and my 8-year-old self and my specific needs and developmental milestones attained. And we need to start focusing on what the industry is doing and holding them accountable for this. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Now I noticed a number of hands have come up, so I'm going to just try to take them in also in order of people who haven't had a chance to say. So I'm going to say Moon, if you could start, then Vidi, and Emma and Patricia can also jump in. And by the way, if you could also mention anything around brain specificity of the effects. A number of people have been asking what exactly are the brain effects of this on circuitry, on neurodevelopment, that kind of thing, and also in relation to sleep. There have been a few questions. But over to you, Moon.
Thank you, Franco. I just wanted to echo and underscore what Sarah just said about holding platforms accountable. A couple years back, when Wall Street Journal and Washington Post both did their investigative journalism sort of series on looking at these platforms and their harms. In one case, they created sort of these fake profiles of being a 13-year-old girl who is on TikTok. And one of the things that they found is that within half hour of being on the platform or having searched something on eating disorders, the entire feed only had eating disorder content. It just took 30 minutes. So as I said also earlier in my pitch, we have to look at not just the amount of time kids are spending on these platforms, but what these algorithms are doing to their experiences on these platforms. It's a critical part of our understanding. Holding platforms accountable is something that is not new. It's been said many times over again in different countries and legislative processes. But one of the biggest bottlenecks that comes around implementing policy is that, if you want to hold them accountable and design policy for that, it has to be grounded on evidence. And that evidence right now is sparse in the sense that we don't quite know what these algorithms are doing to kids. All what we know are what oftentimes tech companies tell us about the impact of these algorithms on kids. And not a surprise, oftentimes we hear stories of either the algorithms not resulting in harm or the algorithms resulting in positive benefits. Some of that might be true, but it's not the full picture. And one thing that prevents other neutral or third-party researchers to investigate and ask the same questions is that the data about how these algorithms operate is locked behind the doors of these companies. And therefore, we don't have high quality, good, unbiased evidence on which we can frame policy or legislation to hold these companies and platforms accountable. And this is something many scholars in this area have been arguing for the last couple of years is how do we open the floodgates? How do we enable data access to researchers so that they can study the impact that these platform algorithms are having. But that itself is a question of policy and legislation. So as we try to minimize the negative impact of social media on young people's mental health, we also have to look at the different stakeholders who are part of this conversation and how do we give people access to build evidence and contribute evidence at the same footing based on objective measurements and objective data.
But it's a great point when particularly we talk about have we reached the threshold? Is one of the questions. Part of the question has the research and science world reached a threshold of understanding to merit policy implications. Right now, we're relying largely on the companies and their research, and I think in some ways it's all coming at us so quickly that we're typically one step behind and trying to keep up with new and emerging knowledge and information. But that becomes a policy question. Maybe that should be part of the policy. That we need, just like we have prioritized research in certain areas at certain times. We did it with COVID. Look what we did during the COVID crisis. We can, maybe this needs to be thought of, not necessarily as a crisis, but something, an urgency that's needed to be addressed. Vidhi, over to you.
Thank you. So I know there's a lot of concerned parents in the chat, and I want to tailor my answer to fostering more understanding on maybe the recipient's end. So when we're saying things like, oh, you can't view your screen or you can't, view it for more than 3 hours, we're not really explaining the why behind it, right? And I understand that sometimes it's very tricky to have those conversations because how are you going to explain brain development to a 5-year-old who's resisting getting off their iPad? But there are tools out there. So, for example, in my work as a children's book illustrator, I've illustrated books on the gut microbiome, brain development, and now I'm illustrating one on sleep hygiene. So I think my point here is to really ask yourselves when you're, saying these rules and you're, you're trying to foster this sort of understanding. it's really necessary to explain why this understanding is necessary and how it actually impacts child development, right? We have conversations on puberty, we have conversations on nutrition, and all of that is to help overall development. So I think we really need to offer that same cadence to things like digital health.
Great, thank you. Thank you for those comments, Vidhi. I will share with you that, one of the frustrations of doing a panel like this is that there's just so much to cover and so little time. But I think the important thing is we're touching on kind of the peaks of mountains of information and insights. So we're working through it. But Emma and Patricia also had her hand up. But Emma, maybe you want to say a few words?
Yeah, I just wanted to have make some comments just about the question on screen time in children with neurodevelopmental disorders. So for some children who have difficulties with communication or mobility, then a lot of technologies can have obviously enormous benefits. But it's also at the same time, it's important for parents to be aware that for children on the autism spectrum, children with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, they can be more drawn to using screens. They can, for example, for rewards, and in turn, they may be more likely to spend more time on screens, and it has been associated with things like impaired or with difficulties with social interactions later on. And of course, more time spent on screens means less time spent on other things and less time for things like therapies that can be very beneficial and to promote social skills and healthy development in children.
Great, thank you. Patricia, did you want to say something? There were some questions on neurodivergent, but Patricia, did you have a few words you wanted to comment on?
Oh, I think the panelists have all made my comments. I'll just reinforce the importance of rigorous science on these many different topics. And I guess what I wanted to add is that, as Sarah Grimes described, these are now, or some of these products are designed to be addictive, and to remove someone's own kind of free will around how they interact with content and the platforms themselves. And so we should be kind of approaching some of these platforms as potentially promoting addictive behaviors and being addictive substances, and therefore thinking about regulation policy in a similar way, but also applying research designs that are relevant. So more than I think any other research area, that's where randomized trials are important, right? Is that these products and these particular behaviors often have this catch where they have this subjective well-being to them, particularly in the immediate sense. And that can be extremely misleading for the user, for, even for the research itself. If you focus purely on people's subjective well-being and subjective reactions to the products, you often get very positive outcomes. And it's only in the context of longitudinal designs, repeated measures designs, and control designs that you realize that certain behaviors and products have these unintended consequences to them. And I think it's really important that we begin to design, collaborate around very rigorous research studies that are going to allow us to weigh these short-term benefits that people report experiencing in relation to certain products, and the longer-term harms and potential unintended consequences of some of these products and behaviors. And I very much liked Moonmunda Chowdhury's points, and that is, how far are we ever going to get if we don't have some kind of established partnership with industry in order to be able to access some of the information that we need to be able to better understand some of these behaviors and products. So I know there's some effort in the US to force industry to, submit some of their products to this, Center for a research center that would protect IP, but also provide researchers with access to critical IP and algorithms to then be able to understand them better from a perspective of safety. So yeah, this is an enormous industry with a lot of research questions associated with it, and I believe we absolutely need to ramp up, significantly ramp up our investment in research on this topic.
Well, thank you for that, Patricia. And you know, the comments that we're hearing around partnership with industry, I think, become quite salient, particularly if you think of this in terms of the pace of change. You know, industry is able to move forward very, very quickly, and we don't know what we don't know. So things are being introduced where we haven't had the opportunity yet to do the kind of research that Patricia and others, you know, we're talking about. And so there's a different speed. Research has its own pace, if you will. And maybe the solution to that misalignment, if you will, is the partnership. You know, the coming together of industry with the academic and research community to work together on some of these questions, because in the long term, it's going to be important and beneficial for everyone. I'm going to open it up for final thoughts, but there has been a couple of questions that have come up around neurodivergent populations, both youth and adults. Does anybody want to just comment on that? I'm conscious of the fact that there have been some Q&As around that particular population, and maybe brain effects and developmental implications.
All I can say is from our data that we do find that there's an interaction between individual differences and some of the mental health harms of social media, a little less so the other digital products, but with respect to social media, so particularly for a young person who is more prone to depression to begin with, who might already be experiencing some depressive symptoms, it appears that they're more likely to experience depression from the content they're exposed to on social media. And we explain that potentially through these echo chambers and reinforcing spirals. But again, it's very hard to know, what they're, how these algorithms are working. And then we also have some preliminary evidence to suggest that also ADHD, and I think there are many other studies suggesting that children with ADHD are more susceptible to the effects of social media, just repeated use, higher levels of use, but also the effects of social media on their attentional abilities and their impulsivity.
Thank you, Patricia. Emma, Michelle, and then Moonman.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment quickly just on the impacts on the brain. So even something like passive television watching is associated with changes in the brain. And so just very broadly, so the brain's cognitive control center, our frontal lobes, which is responsible for executive functions, decision making. This is really a part of our brain that develops quite late in life, so even into our late 20s, early 30s. And what we often see with excessive screen time use is that it can be associated with a disconnect in terms of how well our cognitive control center is connecting with other parts of our brain responsible for things like social processing and recognizing the thoughts and feelings of others. These are, of course, very complex constructs. To Michelle's comment previously about the co-viewing, when we're co-viewing, children are still getting the real natural interaction from a parent, which is really necessary for healthy brain development to help those parts of the brain start to connect with one another. So it's not just the viewing itself, it's also the absence of other types of interactions, as well as, of course, the more time children spend on screens, the less time time in a day is finite. There more time on screens mean less time for doing other things that are really essential for healthy brain development, including sleep, physical activity, interacting with others that children really need to thrive.
Great, thanks very much, Emma. Michelle, comments?
Thank you. Wow, I'm really loving this discussion. I mean, it's a very broad-based discussion, and I'll be very brief. The question about the neurodiversity, neurodivergent, neurodevelopmental disorders. So from the pediatric medicine lens, we really need to look at how do we mitigate the screen impacts. And when a child presents to me, it's my role to really rule out, are there other neurodevelopmental conditions that need treatment and management, such as ADHD, as Patricia mentioned, autism, speech and language disorders, communication delays, and mood and anxiety disorders. So my role is to help look at that, all the symptoms, and sort out how does it fit in, is it the chicken or the egg, and manage those conditions as well as give sort of good screen time guidance.
Great, thank you. Thank you for that, Michelle. Moon, some comments?
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a little bit nuance here when we think about neurodivergent individuals. I think the comparisons with TV are not really adequate here, because the equivalent of that in social media would be passive consumption, which certainly is a very big part of it. But we have to also think about people don't just go to social media for passive consumption of content, but also to actively engage with peers and other people. And research has shown that for neurodivergent individuals, whether it's people who are identified to be on the autism spectrum, they actually find it relieving to be on social media, because on social media they can define their own social norms, and they're not limited by the social constructs and constraints that may exist in the offline world. Online, on social media, they can also find peers with similar experiences, and this can be very empowering to these individuals. So we have to, when we think about social media neurodivergent individuals, we have to think about these types of active engagement as well. The same thing goes for individuals with mental health concerns. A lot of my work has been working with that population, and people with anxiety, depression, or psychosis often find that going to social media is a way to get away from the difficult realities of life that they're experiencing, or the loneliness or hopelessness that they might be experiencing. And it's a moment for them to connect with other people, find a way to explain to themselves or understand their symptoms and experiences better, and knowing that they are not alone in this journey.
Great points. Thank you. Thank you for that. Patricia, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I do want to make sure that we're having kind of a balanced perspective on things, and Moon, it's extremely important to also recognize the potential risks to people with neurodivergent experiences and profiles, who are also susceptible to the potential harms on social media, and that's very well documented as well. And so yes, there are benefits that are unique to someone's individual needs. There are also particular risks, and so that that discussion always has to be had in a very balanced way. The other thing is, I did want to point out, Emma, that I believe the literature is quite mixed on this idea that one of the ways in which digital media or screen time is affecting young people is by taking time away from other activities. It's a reasonable explanation, but actually the literature on that idea is quite mixed, and that's because there's not a lot of literature on it, and the kids who are doing other activities find ways of catching up and getting that time in on social media and on other screen time, and it's not so much dose, it's what they're being exposed to and what they're learning. And if it's unsupervised and on platforms that are more likely to expose them to content that promotes social norms for early, for substance misuse, promotes social norms around antisocial behavior, and promotes unrealistic, ideals for young people, they're more likely to suffer from mental health harms independent of whether they're physically active or interacting with other people in the offline world. So the literature is mixed, and again, we need more research on this.
Terrific. Thank you. Thank you again. Moon, did you want?
Just a quick echo what Patricia said about the displacement hypothesis. The literature is indeed very mixed. In fact, we don't know when kids spend excessive amount of time on social media. Is it because they're taking away time from, let's say, TV watching, or is it taking away time from like offline social interaction? So if it's the former, maybe it's not so bad. If it's the latter, that's problematic. So we have to kind of, this is a question that is very much tailored to the individual, and to understand whether there is a real displacement happening that is harmful, we kind of have to look at the context of the individual.
Great, thank you for those comments. The initial plan, and talk about adapting to fast-moving situations. We've adapted to the fast-moving situation in this particular panel because there were so many questions and perspective, very broad topic. And the original plan was to have all of the panelists spend about 3 minutes at the end with their thoughts. We only have about 5 or 6 minutes for that before concluding remarks. Viti, I was going to ask you, do you have any other thoughts you want to share, with the group? You made some comments, and it's so important to have that youth perspective. I'm reminded of years ago when I went across the country talking to youth around the marijuana cannabis legislation, and perspective. It was very very interesting to see the professionals and youth perspective, and maybe you want to say a few words.
Yeah, I'm not a formal researcher whatsoever, so I will keep all of that up to my fellow panelists here. But in terms of the discussion we're having and the role we all play, I understand that there's a lot of attendees here that are listening to the words we're saying, but I think there's also space for everyone to be involved. One way is to become things like parent collaborators. So I've just put a link in the chat. We're illustrating a new children's book with the Young Canadians Roundtable on Health, and we want to make sure that it includes diverse perspectives and voices. And one way to make your voice heard is to participate in initiatives like that. I think that there is space for everyone to participate in this conversation. I know that there's not that much space today for everyone to get their voice heard, but rest assured that there are spaces out there. So yeah, I think that's my overall message.
Great, thank you for that, Viti. And I see you've already responded. We had a question, I think a couple who wanted to know about your books, your children's books. So it's I noticed that you've already responded on the chat in real time. So that's great. And actually, on that note, I should mention that if there are any other references or questions, feel free, even after this session, this is to the audience, to submit questions to the CSPC or Brain Canada, and we'll get references for you in addition to the ones that have already been shared. We've got maybe 2 minutes before I wrap it up and do my thank yous. Are there any final words of wisdom or thoughts from the panel before we move to the final words? Yes, Michelle.
I'll just chime in 10 seconds. So 2 points. If you want any more information about screen time guidance, check out all the resources on the Canadian Pediatric Society Caring for Kids. And we can, all of us adults here today and in the audience, be good models. So model the healthier use of screens and digital technology in our lives.
Terrific, thank you. All right, well, on that note, let me just add my own final thoughts. First of all, let me start with actually an apology for to the audience for not being able to get to all of the questions. I've tried my best to try to capture some of the themes and maybe steer some of the conversations in ways that address the question and bridge some of the thoughts from the panelists with the questions coming from the audience. It's a huge topic. There's so much. There was so much to cover. I really see this as a point in a long journey. It's clearly a topic that requires ongoing attention, and there's the risk. I would say that the challenge of managing all this can feel overwhelming for those both in the field, but particularly for those outside of the field, particularly as new knowledge and impacts come at us so quickly. And you know, we you know, in the old days we used to talk about the sea of knowledge. I really think of it more as a river, a fast-flowing river, the rapids of knowledge. You know, you're in one spot and literally things just change so quickly. And the shelf life, if you think of the shelf life of information and knowledge, used to be so much longer, and it could help with policy development. You could feel confident that ideas that we had at the time at least had a shelf life for 5 or 10 years. Those days are over, and the shelf life is getting shorter and shorter, and the cycle time of new knowledge and information is getting so quick that it really requires, and you know, the point about partnerships with industry, I think that rapidity of pace that we see in industry needs to somehow be aligned with the realities of how we do science and how we do research, and maybe partnerships in the future will be something that perhaps policies can capture more strongly. Today's conversation reminds me of the importance of these sessions and in keeping the conversation alive and moving forward. The goals of the session, I would say, today were less about, I guess, the destination or the conclusions, and more about understanding the journey and the path as we have to adapt and respond to these fast-changing realities. And I think Moon or others said, it's not a question of if. This is a reality that the train has long left the station, and it's so critical that we keep these conversations alive, keep them top of mind, and work towards bridging the fast pace with the realities that we need for science and research to stay on top of these issues. You know, one of the points that's been raised is developing the tools and understanding, and you know, for this, you know, one of the questions that come up is, do we have the understanding and tools to differentiate between the beneficial effects and the risks associated? And you know, that we've heard over and over that it's not just about time spent, it's about the content and exactly what the nature of that dynamic is between the user and the technology. So do we have the tools and do we have the understanding to actually differentiate between beneficial and risk effects, knowing what we know about the brain effects? And you know, maybe I'll just end with a point about in many ways it feels like we continue to go into the unknown. And you know, fear of the unknown is probably the oldest emotion in human beings, and we tend to associate it with a negativity, the unknown and the uncertainty. And there's certainly a downside to the unknown uncertainty, and that is fear, avoidance, and immobility. But the upside of the unknown and uncertainty is hope and discovery. And I think that really was the purpose of today's session, is that this is really introducing the opportunities for discovery, for deeper understanding. And I hope that today's sessions underscore the importance of science, particularly the brain sciences in particular, as we look to the upside of uncertainty, that is discovery and hope, particularly as it applies to youth and the use of screen time. So on that note, a huge thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much. And I think we're going to see more of these panels, and maybe even breaking them out into different stages of development, different areas of mental health as the months and years unfold. So Thank you again to all of you, and finally, a huge thank you to the audience for your participation and your Q&A questions, which I did my best to bring together in the panel discussion. Thank you all. Have a wonderful weekend. We're not there yet, but almost. So have a great rest of the week, and all the very, very best to you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.